now it's being recorded. Yes, so question paper 2 is due on Saturday, the 17th. With that, nothing changes with that question paper. Still worth 20 points, still 1 page, 2 references. The thing that will change, and I should change this on the schedule, you won't have a question paper 3 any longer. You will have a final question paper that will be very similar, but it will, instead of being 1 page of content, at least 2 pages of content and at least 3 references, 2 of which are peer-reviewed journals. So just a little bit of a change, and it's also going to be worth 50 points rather than 20. So I'm hoping you find a little more research, are reading through more research, and writing a little more extensive or in-depth paper on a topic. Some of you are already writing about 2 pages. So for those of you who are already writing about 2 pages, this isn't going to be much of a change at all. Some of you, usually when you're writing about 2 pages, you're using more than 3 references anyway. So for those of you who are already writing about that, that's essentially what I'm expecting for this final question paper. So again, no question paper 3 anymore, but the question paper 2, I've changed its name to midterm question paper, and it is still due this coming Saturday. No change in the rubric or format of it. It's still 1 page, 2 references, at least one of those peer reviewed. So all of the feedback and what you did for question 1, paper 1, you can transfer that over to your knowledge of how to write question paper 2. It's not till this final question paper that anything's really going to change. And that essentially frees up more time for grading those papers and not having so many papers coming in throughout the semester. So then I can hopefully stay a little bit more on top of them. We'll see if that actually turns out to be the case. Little experiment here. So questions about that. Question paper 2, now named midterm question paper, still due Saturday, the 17th. Any questions about that paper at all? Definitely go check your grade and the comments especially. I'm never sure if it actually notifies you. Sometimes it seems like it's notifying students and sometimes it doesn't seem like Canvas notifies you. Maybe it's settings that you have set on your end. But everybody's grades are in, everybody's comments are in for their question papers. I don't see any hands or anybody commenting. Oh, here we go. Oh, good question. Yes, so rather than having 2 possible extra credit question papers, now it's down to 1 possible extra credit question paper. So that's in addition to the final question paper. So you can do 1 extra credit question paper, and that will now be worth 50 points. So total extra credit points is actually increased, and instead of doing 2 papers, now 1 is possible, and 50 points for that 1 paper. So good question, Des. And then I saw a hand as well, but then it went down before I saw whose it was. So perhaps that answered your question as well. Otherwise, feel free to type it in the comments or raise your hand again. With these things about the question paper, I have already changed in Canvas the question paper instructions. I've updated that document to be the new instructions. So 2 pages, about 600 words as a minimum, the 3 references. So it's essentially the same document that you've seen before, just with the updated point values and rubrics and things. Good question. So how would you recommend putting things into your own words for research? Because it is often, depending on the topic, it can be really far out of the normal terminology that you'd use. Some people used a lot of quotes in their question papers, and some people used very few. Let's get an example of, well, actually, we can open this example question paper right here. Actually, I don't need to download it. It should load itself up right here. And if it doesn't, I'll just open it right here. All right, so this is an example question paper that you can download. It's about what are the possible negative effects of Ritalin. So as you read through actually, I don't think I use any direct quotes in this one. I did add a direct quote in the new instructions example. So let's open that one instead. That might be more useful. All right, so the instructions have a question paper on how are moral emotions related to moral values. So here, I'm not going to read it all to you, but if you look through, you'll see, oh no, did I not upload the PDF? Oh, I see what I did. I opened the one from my computer, the old version from my computer. Oops. So the one on Canvas is correct. I just opened the wrong one, so entirely my fault. All right, instructions. There we go. There's the most. So this document you can see on Canvas, and you'll see here there is a quote. So this quote, moral values are internalized standards or the internalized moral norms and conventions people ascribe to. In other words, a tendency to believe that certain actions are good or bad. So that, to define moral values, it could be kind of a hard thing to put into your own words. So things like definitions, I think, are a really good thing to go to for direct quotes. When you're talking about other topics, so here I have another direct quote. Infant crying when exposed to the crying of other infants is a commonly cited evidence of early empathy. So this comes from this researcher, so it's a direct quote there. So with that, I wanted that fact just there as an example of a direct quote, but I could paraphrase this and say, so let's say the paragraph is talking about the fact that infants, one early evidence of empathy might be that when an infant hears another infant cry, they will often cry themselves. This seems, and when you do brain scans, it seems like they are picking up on that emotion and they're starting to feel that themselves. Not that they're just sad that someone's crying, but they are sharing that emotion. So that's a first stage of developing empathy. An infant obviously doesn't have the capacity to put itself in another human's shoes yet, like to think about themselves as another person, but they can feel what other people feel. Or at least that's evidence that some people suggest is a starting point of empathy. So instead of writing this sentence this way, infant crying when exposed to the crying of other infants is a commonly cited evidence of early empathy, rather than taking that as a direct quote, something that I could do is say, just in my own words, something about that. So that infant crying is one of the earliest examples of empathy that we see. And then I would still use this part of the in-text citation, but I wouldn't have the page number, I wouldn't have the direct quotes. If I've learned from a paper about the topic of moral values, I wouldn't need to put it in a direct quote. I could just say moral values are related to standards people have, the norms of a culture. So I'm saying similar things, a similar kind of things, but I'm putting it more in my own language. And maybe it's not as great of an example for me to kind of put it in my language because I now kind of speak this language, but hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea, Lindsay, and anyone else in the class as well, of how to put the research into your own words. So most of this entire paper has the research put into my own words. So let's see if we can find a good example of, so this is using two sources that are kind of talking about the same thing. These feelings to care for others are fostered and framed by the values of parents, peers, and society as various behaviors and attitudes are experienced and then directly or indirectly reinforced and affirmed or punished and devalued. So that's actually, as I'm reading that now, like sometimes you read things and you're like, oh yeah, I've packed a lot of good stuff into that sentence. That's not actually a very good sentence I wrote there. But beside that, I'm talking about the idea that parents, peers, society in general, they give you experiences, you see their examples, they can punish when you behave one way or devalue some ways or reinforce and affirm other behaviors. And so those kinds of feelings of care towards others can be fostered or squashed essentially because of these processes. So if I had a whole study that essentially said, hey, society can play a big part in moral development, in people's moral behaviors, that might be one way to go about paraphrasing that. So hopefully that gives some new ideas of how you might go about paraphrasing the research. Definitely, if you need to use a direct quote, use a direct quote. I think definitions are a good place for that. If there's a fact or something that you really think is said a lot more clearly than you could, put that in there. Try like this to not have your whole paper be direct quotes rather than like copying and pasting it. Try to have a lot more of it in your own words. That shows me that you understand the material more than just putting together quotes from papers. So it shows me that you're understanding what the papers are reporting, and then you can report it clearly. So it's part of the process too. But it's not like you have to keep all direct quotes out entirely. You can also use your own thoughts and opinions. I believe my Ritalin paper, is it loaded? Nope, it's not loaded. Let's pull that one up. That's an example of one where I put some of my own personal experience. So here at the end, I talk about how in class I discussed how my mother did not want me to use Ritalin for the treatment of my ADHD. So that's kind of what prompted my question. And so I talk about that a little bit in the beginning. And then in the end, I'm like, so I found out that even though back then my mom was worried because of things, there might have been a few things that she should be worried about, like growth's being stunted. But generally, Ritalin, one of her biggest fears was that Ritalin would be addictive, and that doesn't turn out to be the case. So that's an example of where I put in some of my own thoughts or like how this is tied to it. So definitely, it's definitely a research paper, so it shouldn't all be your opinions with like one or two sites. It should be mostly the research paper, but then you can have your opinions and ideas and thoughts around this research intermixed. And hopefully your opinions that you formed because of your reading of research is well informed. Yeah, feel free to use first person. So I observed, or I'm going to talk about. I know for myself, I like to write in the first person. So some professors, they are very strict about saying you have to write in third person. For me, keep it consistent throughout the whole paper. So if you're starting in first person, do the whole paper in first person. If you're starting in third person, do the whole paper in third person. Generally, I find that journals are the same way. Anytime I publish in a journal, I have to make sure that the paper I've written fits their requirements. And some scientific journals are okay with using first person. I like those ones a lot because that's how I just generally write. But some say absolutely no first person, and so I have to make sure that I'm writing to that journal. So I think it's a good skill to have to write in first or third person and be able to switch it back and forth. So just make sure you're consistent through your paper. All right, well, that was a lot longer than I intended to talk about question papers, but hopefully that cleared up any confusion anybody has. So other questions, though, feel free to type them. Feel free to raise your hand. All right, well, let's do a quick review of attachment. So as we talked about it last time, we talked about the strange situation as one of the primary ways we investigate attachment. So I'll just quickly run through these again. As I do this, maybe jot down a couple notes about what you might expect to see with any given attachment style, because you'll jump off into your groups, the groups that you're using for the group presentation, and you will make a rubric with them for what to look for, and then we'll watch a video of the strange situation playing out, and you'll just try to decide which kind of attachment these children have. So for a secure attachment, usually it's really defined by using the caregiver as a secure base. So when the caregiver and the child come into a room, the child might feel more comfortable exploring than other children. They might try out new toys. If they get scared, they might come back to the parent and then leave again. They will probably cry when the parent leaves, but when the parent comes back, they'll be able to really quickly reestablish positive interactions and maybe even get back to playing as well. Versus with some of the insecure attachments, like insecure avoidant, they might not be worried at all when the parent leaves. So they might avoid the caregiver when they first come into the room. They don't really care when the caregiver leaves. They don't try to establish contact when the caregiver comes back. They maybe even try to move away. So that's insecure avoidant. Insecure resistant. It seems like they want attention, but they also are worried that they're not going to get it. So probably in their home life, they've had some like close moments, but also they know they can't always rely on that parent to be there. So because of that, they want to cling to the caregiver, but sometimes they also might just resist and kind of stay away. So they don't usually explore the room and the toys. They'll usually cry very loudly and be really bothered when the caregiver leaves. But then when the caregiver comes back, they often won't be able to calm down very quickly. And then they won't get back to playing with toys, that kind of thing. So that's insecure resistant. And those are really the only ones we need to worry about right now. The insecure disorganized is very rare, and it's not one of the examples in the videos. So there's a hint for you. It's out of those three. So what I want you to do in your groups is not these groups of 3 to 5, but your groups that you're working on for your presentation later on. So get in those groups for just a couple minutes, make a couple notes, maybe in your chat boxes of things to look for. And then we'll come back here at 7:30 and we'll watch a couple attachment videos. And then you'll go back to your groups and decide together what kind of attachment style videos 1 and 2 were. So jump into your groups right now really quickly. I'll show you how to do that again if you've forgotten. So to get to those, you can go to the Teams. Hopefully this doesn't actually shut down my screen sharing as I do this. So then you can go to whichever chapter you're in, Happiness Chapter 9, Memory Chips for Life group, Operant Conditioning group. So jump into those groups and jot down a couple things in your chat boxes about, oh, I think it did send me away. Hopefully you heard everything I was saying. So jump into your little groups, jot down in your notes a couple things to look for, and then be back here at 7:30 to watch these videos. All right, hopefully everyone's jumping back in here right now. Let me see if I can tell. Looks like we have a lot of people still out of the room. I'm going to see if I can force them back. Never mind, that doesn't work that way. So I'll just wait a couple more seconds. Hopefully more students jump over small groups. All right, let me see if I'll go check to see if I can tell who is still meeting and tell them to get back here. All right, so hopefully everyone is back now. Looks like I'm still sharing. So we're going to go through and we'll watch 2 videos. So after we watch the 2 videos, then you'll jump back with your groups and try to decide with video 1, was that secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and then you'll also talk about that for video 2. So we'll watch both videos just back to back. Okay, so for right now then, Lindsay, for anyone whose group just didn't show up in those little group boxes, look at these videos yourself rather than working on it in a group, and that'll be just fine. So I'm going to play these videos, and we'll see if we can decide whether you're with a group or individually as well, what these attachment styles are. So we'll watch 2 videos and then talk in groups or look at your own rubric to decide what attachment style you think these are. So it should just autoplay if I open this up, because if I link to YouTube, it says the attachment style in the video title. So let me see if I can get this to work correctly in presentation mode. Oh no. All right, I'm gonna have to stop sharing to open up the YouTube video so you don't see the answer beforehand. All right, it's ready. So let's watch this video and try to decide what kind of attachment style we see here.
The caregiver then leaves and the stranger interacts with the baby.
Mommy will be back. Come. Come. Mommy will be back. Let's play together. It's okay. Mommy will be back. Oh, I know. Mommy will be back. It's okay. It's okay. Shall we play with the toys? Shall we play with the toys? Huh? Do you want to sit on here? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Come on. Put 1 foot up. 1 foot up. And up you go. You're on a truck. Now you're on a truck. And you can push. Can you push? You want him to ride with you? I know, she'll be back. I know. know. Mommy's coming back. Mommy's going to come back.
The caregiver signals her return and enters.
Caroline. Hi. Hi, sweetie. Did you miss Mommy? Did you miss Mommy?
Reunites with the baby and interacts with the baby while the stranger
Are you
leaves.
making a sign for Mama's milk? Yeah, it's not time for that right now. But we can play with some toys. Let's play with some toys. Do you see a big dinosaur? And do you see a tiger? Let's see if we can find the tiger. I think we can find him. Hi.
So I did cut out some of the interaction because honestly, these experiments, well, these simulations, they take about 15 to 30 minutes depending on how you do it. So I just wanted to cut a couple pieces out of that. So really quickly, write down just on your own a few things you noticed, why you think it might be a certain attachment style, and then we're going to jump right into the second attachment style. All right, let's jump into the second video and see if you can pick up any differences or similarities here. See if it's the same or a different attachment style.
She's really nice. She's really nice. You know how to play? No? Yeah. Let's play with the cards, Mila. You have your fun? The baby? Oh, you know it's a baby? What's the baby's name? You want me to take it over? Hi, Destiny. Good. Hi, Destiny. 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 minute. You having fun?
All right, so those are the two different videos. You can see in the second one, they did a few other things that the first video did not. So having the child play by themselves, as well as having them play with the stranger, like the stranger coming in without the caregiver. So depending on how you do this study, you can add those different components to see the change, essentially any switch over from the child being alone to with the stranger to with the parent. You might pick up on some of those different aspects that would suggest whether a child is securely attached to their caregiver or not. So jump back into your groups. Hopefully it doesn't take you too long. Let's come back here at 7:45 and talk about, kind of vote on who thinks it's what. So jump into your groups, talk about the evidence you saw for example 1 and example 2, which kind of attachment style you think it is, and be back here at 7:45.
Oh, this is While we're rejoining, I'm gonna go pee. No, we're good. No, I just have to pee while we're rejoining together in the main chat.
I think a couple group members jumped back but didn't mute their microphones. All right. Well, hopefully we've got everybody back now. I'm going to make this easiest, let's just kind of vote in the chat box, essentially what your group said it was. So I don't know if you picked a spokesperson. I didn't remember to tell you to pick a spokesperson in your group, but just let me know what your group decided on. If 2 or 3 group members type it out, that's fine. So for number 1, so for example number 1, what kind of attachment style did you think that was?
They're both fun. Why one was harder? They look like they're both going to be the same consistency.
Yesterday, we literally, they're both vanilla.
Yes.
White.
All right, it looks like we're in agreement that the first example is secure attachment. So that's correct. That first example is a good example of secure attachment. Does anyone want to point out any specific things that they could see in this interaction that told them that this child was securely attached to their caregiver? Feel free to either type it in or get on your microphone and say it to everybody that way as well. Yeah, definitely cried when the mother left, but was able to interact with the stranger. Yep. You might see the similar behavior with also insecure, disorganized, or even insecure, resistant as well. Just that specific example of crying when the mother leaves and interacting with a stranger. It would be a little unusual that quickly to interact with a stranger if you're insecure or resistant, because it can be really hard to get them to calm down when they're upset. Even the parent coming back, they'll often not calm down to that. Any other things that suggested to you that in this example the child had a secure attachment? Yeah, the behavior very apparently changed very quickly when the caregiver came back through the door. Really good point. So with that, you might see it even with a securely attached child, that might take a little longer. So if you've ever seen children, say, being picked up from preschool and they're really upset, or being picked up from a babysitter's and they're really upset that the parent was gone, it might even take a little longer than that. But that was it's one of the reasons I chose this clip, is because it was really clear in that really short amount of time that the child was able to calm down really quickly. And one thing I find interesting is that the child was giving the sign to their caregiver for mama's milk. So to get that extra comfort of feeding. So also explored toys. Yep. So if you're insecure resistant, you probably wouldn't be exploring toys with that stranger around, or so yeah, good point there. So all right, let's talk about the second example. I also do have a third example here in the video if you want to, and the slides if you want to go through that. I essentially just never have time to go through 3 examples. I'm always too far behind and trying to catch up and get to chapter 11 when going through chapter 8. All right, so what do we think for attachment style 2, or the example 2? So it looks like we've got a vote for insecure avoidant, and then others that say definitely insecure, but aren't quite sure which kind of insecure. Is that what I'm getting from this then? So insecure avoidant is this one I've got on the screen. And then there's also insecure resistant that we talked about. So insecure avoidant, insecure avoidant. Yeah, very good. So I think insecure avoidant is the best description here. So what were some things? So I'll put this back up since it seems like maybe we're getting some we're not sure about the different insecures. So which specific behaviors did you see from this interaction that suggested that it was insecure avoidant as opposed to insecure resistant and insecure disorganized? Because I told you it wasn't. But insecure avoidant versus resistant, why'd you pick insecure avoidant? Yeah, I think that was a really clear sign at the end there that the the child was completely avoiding the attention of the caregiver. The caregiver was trying to interact, but the child was completely avoidant, did not try to reestablish contact in any way. Yeah, that's a good point too. It didn't seem like the child cared about having the caregiver there. They had very little interaction with them. Really good point. So with that, you can see these two different situations. We saw some short interactions. One thing that we find is that even though it's kind of a contrived setting, some weird lab room, yeah, and also they didn't seem worried about the caregiver leaving. So whether they were left with the stranger, left by themselves, this child did not seem worried or distressed at all about that. So with that, even though this is kind of a contrived example of this child's placed in this room where probably the caregiver and the child have never been, it can have lots of stuff on the walls or fewer things on the walls, toys, fewer toys. An interesting thing we find is that if you do the strange situation with a caregiver and child and then go to their home environment and watch them throughout the day, you'll be able to pick up some of those same behaviors. And this kind of assessment for deciding the attachment style is actually really a valid and reliable way to tell in a short period of time what kind of attachment they have. So you might think, well, why might this child have a secure attachment versus this child be in having an insecure avoidant attachment? Well, you see, one thing I pick up here is that the child is very independent. They are not worried about the caregiver leaving, maybe because it's possible their caregiver has to work multiple jobs. Maybe they have to play on their own a lot. Maybe they have other caregivers that are babysitters and can't pay as close of attention because of all the things that they have to do, right? Versus maybe this caregiver is able to be a stay-at-home parent or something like that. So not to say that anyone who is a stay-at-home parent will definitely have a securely attached child, because that's definitely not the case. And not to say that someone who is working multiple jobs outside of the home will have an insecure avoidantly attached child, because that's definitely not the case either. Just trying to think of scenarios of how this might happen, how a child might realize that, well, and know that they can't always rely on the caregiver, that they do have to be dependent on their own. That could come from a lot of different contextual factors, right? The individual behavior of the caregiver versus the contextual factor having to be out of the home versus having more responsibilities, having other kids, things like that. There can be a lot of different things that go into the development of this kind of attachment style. And one of the reasons this is important, we touched on last time, is because these attachment styles can essentially follow us through our lifespan. So, for example, when dating, oftentimes we find partners who share our same attachment style. So if two people are securely attached, they will tend to come together and have a securely attached relationship. If we have two people that are insecure avoidant, they will tend to match up because that's kind of what they're expecting from a relationship. It's working how they're kind of expecting. But you might imagine two people with an insecure avoidant attachment style might not, as a romantic relationship, might not be as easy as two securely attached people. So, and like we mentioned last time, people's attachment styles can change throughout life. Just on average, about 70% of people keep their same attachment style all throughout life, but it can definitely change. Let's say an insecurely avoidant person, when they're in their 20s, is dating someone who's securely attached. They can learn that that is a kind of attachment style. They can essentially adopt a securely attached style and then for the rest of their life be securely attached. Someone who's adopted or fostered by someone with a securely attached attachment style or an insecure attachment style can then keep that the rest of their life. So it's one of those things that will tend to stay the same throughout life, but it can change. So an interesting feature of early life and childhood that follows us through our lives and can affect some of the way that we interact with people throughout the rest of our lives. All right, so we've now spent an hour of today on chapter 8. All right, I'll read this question really quick. Really good question, Richard. So you would want a child who's able to be independent for sure. So for example, you want to be able, when a child is like 4 years old, that they have the capacity to say go to a preschool or a daycare and be left and learn to be secure in that, to be independent enough to do that kind of thing. For an infant, they don't necessarily at this age, before then, like 2 or earlier, you shouldn't really be expecting a child that early to be completely that independent. But definitely, with the secure attachment, you see children that are securely attached, they'll use that parent as a secure base throughout their childhood. So if that secure person is telling you, hey, we're going to preschool, they're probably doing other behaviors to help that child get ready and understand what's going on. They go into the preschool with the child. They say, hey, here's your teacher. These things are safe. This is a space where you're okay. I'll come back for you later. So that secure attachment will allow that child to then be independent in that kind of preschool setting, as an example. So a securely attached child will tend to do better getting dropped off at preschool. They may fuss maybe the first even week or two, and be a little worried, but then they learn that, well, their parent is still that secure base. Their caregiver will come back. They are still safe in this kind of situation. So you see that from a securely attached child, you'll actually develop that kind of independence, that kind of healthy independence, rather than completely avoidant of attachments. They will be more independent versus someone with an avoidant attachment. You don't want a child to be completely avoidant of attachments to everybody. That can make it harder to have things like close friendships and things like that. So that's a really good question. Hopefully I got at the core of your question there as well in my answer. All right, so as you can see, there are more slides here. Definitely read over them. With the time that we have, I don't think we have enough time to go over identity development in detail. Identity development is an aspect of socio-emotional development in adolescence that's really important. But an interesting thing is people tend to think that adolescents are looking for their identity, but we find that this pattern across the world, that people essentially their first time they look and find their identity is in adolescence. So 14, 15 years old, 16, around there might be the first time they're really searching and figuring out their identity, but they might not settle on an identity until closer to even 22. And there's a range in there. But even with that, people can change their identity later on in life. So as a child, children develop a self-concept, understand that they are separate from other people, that they have likes and dislikes that are different than their friends' likes and dislikes, things like that. That self-concept later on is affected by the context around them, the schools that they're going to, the people they're interacting with. They're learning that they can be a different person in different contexts. So they can be a different person at school, they can be a different person on the soccer field, they can be a different person at home or in the clubs that they're in or in a church, things like that. With their different peers, they notice some consistent things about them. So in later childhood, so closer to 10, maybe even 12, they'll notice that, well, across all these different contexts, across my sports team, when I'm hanging out with friends, when I'm at home, and when I'm at school, there's these aspects of myself that are consistent across those things. And late children, early adolescents will pick up on those consistent things. And then as they're going through that early to mid adolescence, and they're having these consistencies, they're having experiences across different contexts, they'll eventually settle on, well, this is really who I am. This is my identity. So it's a process that starts really early on in childhood with understanding that they're different from other people, that they're their own individual, and then building on that through later childhood, early and middle adolescence. And it's not till we get to about 15 or 16 that we first start to see people settle on an identity. But again, that first time of settling on an identity might not be until even like 22. But even with that, this same thing can happen. Let's say, for example, you have a child. This is one that I have personal experience with, that then became a new thing that was consistent across different contexts about myself. So being a parent became part of my identity. I'm sure my parents, when I had a child, being a grandparent probably became part of their identity. People can have identity shifts as well around their jobs or hobbies. Let's say you do a career change when you're 43 or something like that. That can then lead to your identity shifting. So we see identity first kind of being settled on anywhere between about like 15 and 22, but then it is definitely a thing that can be changed and modified throughout the rest of life. There's definitely more that I could say about it, but not with the time we have. Gender identity is man, all these topics, they're so useful and important to talk about, but we just don't have the time to go through them. Please do go through these slides, though. I do have more information in the slides than is discussed in your book. But with the time that we have, I think we need to get to chapter 11. Moral development in early childhood. This is one of my key research interests. So I would definitely say it's hard when I'm a developmental psychologist, so it's like, which one of these is more important? Which of these slides should you read over? Probably just read over all of them. But I think the gender in early childhood is the one that I definitely go, well, I'm bringing in a lot more information beyond the book for the moral development in early childhood as well. It's like painful to me to skip over these topics. But if we get through other content, maybe we'll come back to this later on. So one of the big key pieces to development that I want to reiterate is that an individual exists within a variety of contexts. Any of these children that we watched today in these attachment examples, they frequently see things like people and interact with people that are from their family, from their church, from local health services like doctors or nurses, their peers or their school. And that microsystem, that system that's closest to them, can have a really big impact on them. But that microsystem is also affected by neighbors, local social services, industry, local politics, mass media. And all of that is even influenced by this macrosystem, the attitudes and ideologies of the culture they're in. And so with this, a individual child or an adolescent or an adult can affect the people around them, their parents, their partners, their peers, and then that is a reciprocal interaction. Just as any individual can affect the development of people around them, those people can then affect that person back again. So development is a complex, kind of moving, changing system all throughout time. So with that, let's jump to chapter 11, and we'll talk specifically about social psychology. So social psychology is an area of psychology that, I mean, you could kind of see it as, in some ways, I see it as sharing a lot of the same space as developmental psychology, because it's a big, broad study of how people interact in groups. Generally, studies are in fairly small groups, like 2 people to maybe how one person is impacted by a group of 5 or so. But more recently, social psychologists have been working more with sociologists. Sociologists work on larger group scales, so things like cities or communities or countries, and how those social influences can influence the behavior of other smaller groups, maybe a neighborhood or a block, or social psychologists can say, well, how does that community influence an individual? So there's a lot of overlap, especially in today's research, of social psychology, developmental psychology, sociology. There's a lot of overlap and shared journals, shared articles, shared concepts between these fields. So social psychology, just like developmental psychology, is also very multidisciplinary. That's the word I'm looking for. And I kind of answered my question that I put up there already. So group level behaviors and processes, you might find a lot of social psych research talking about how an individual is influenced by their work group, their work community, or how the different work groups can affect one another, things like that. So usually one big difference where you might be able to pick out, well, this is social psych versus this is sociology, is that usually, not always again, usually social psychology focuses on individual and how the group affects them, or how that individual is affecting the group. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but that kind of might give you a fuzzy dividing line between social psychology and sociology. Sociology generally looks at group level processes and doesn't take into account as much of that individual level processes. But psychology itself is looking at individuals' thoughts, behaviors, feelings, cognitions, things like that. So there is a lot of overlap here. All right, so one of the first things that we should talk about is a basic aspect of social psych is person perception. So all of us form perceptions of other people. So when we look at these 2 pictures here of this person, this is the same person, probably an actor. Honestly, I'm not sure. But so this actor, we form an impression of them based on the clothes they're wearing, their posture, hair, all sorts of things. So the prefrontal cortex is really important for forming these first impressions. We call back to previous memories, interpret observations of this new person. This person perception, you could think of it kind of as a snap judgment of someone. So, and their face is really central to that impression. It happens really, really quickly. And they are surprisingly accurate. Like on average, our person perception, these snap judgments, they're surprisingly accurate, but they are definitely not perfect. So, and we'll definitely get into that. So do you have any examples of in your own life of when your initial impressions were either really spot on or completely incorrect? So time you met someone in a store, you formed a really quick impression of them, and then you saw them completely different after that, or that you were correct. So anyone have any really interesting examples of when your person perception was either correct or incorrect? I've never heard of that one, Richard. So is Blink a documentary? Is it a book? Yeah. So there's entire lines of research on person perception and how it influences people's individual behavior. So it's not surprising that there's an entire book on this specific topic for sure. All right. So it can be hard, especially with the other social psych concepts we're going to be talking about next, to say, hey, I had this perception, it was totally incorrect, or it was totally correct. Because sometimes our person perceptions can lead to things like stereotypes, or can be influenced by things like stereotypes. And so a stereotype in social psych is defined as a generalization about a group. So you might have generalizations about French versus English people. With that, humans have a limited capacity for cognition. So we have only a finite amount of processing power in our prefrontal cortex. So with that, one strategy that we use is to kind of have categories or groups that we put people in. And in the day-to-day life of like going to a grocery store, picking up your food, ordering from someone at a restaurant, just those day-to-day interactions to get essentials done, our stereotypes or person perceptions might work well enough so that we can get those things done. But if you sit down and have a conversation with a person, you'll probably find, as I'm sure you've learned in your life, that a lot of those initial impressions or a lot of the details of those initial impressions or those stereotypes that you have don't hold true very often. So it can be a really useful tool for initial interactions. This is why we've kind of evolved and developed this capacity to have these initial perceptions and to use things like stereotyped groups. So it can be useful, but it can be incredibly incorrect. So with that, self-fulfilling prophecy is the idea that any of our perceptions and stereotypes can cause us to interact with people in ways that cause them to act as we expect. So I think I have some. Yes, I've got some good examples here. So late bloomers versus general students. So there's some examples in your book of this. Some other examples here. If you tell, let's say you take a teacher that's teaching fourth grade and you tell this teacher, hey, these 4 students are late bloomers versus all these students are general students. That teacher will, just based on that perception of these 4 students, give them a little bit more attention, give them a little bit more time, be a little more patient with them. And based on that perception will actually lead to those children doing a little bit better. So that's an example of that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you take that same teacher and say, hey, these 4 students are difficult students, these 4 students are really easy students, just randomly assigned, you just tell them randomly, they will tend to treat those students that they've have that perception of being a difficult student a little bit differently than the ones that they feel are easy students. I'll be maybe a little more patient with the easy students, maybe a little more quick to correct for the difficult students. So these kind of perceptions and stereotypes that we have can lead us to act with people in a way. So again, that developmental concept of bidirectional interaction, we might act with people in a way that leads them to actually behave in a way that confirms these perceptions or stereotypes that we have. So, hey, look, see how this is similar to that bidirectional interaction? So with this, another topic in social psychology that study is stereotype threat. So this is when a person knows the stereotypes that are held of their group, and they'll be really anxious in any relevant scenarios. So knowing that they are a person who has a stereotype about some specific thing, then when they're in relevant scenarios, they will develop some anxiety. So this often happens with sexual minority groups. A variety of races and ethnic minorities have a bunch of stereotypes that might lead them to have anxiety in a variety of situations. Women and girls. I was just watching a show the other day called The Boys on Amazon. It's a superhero show. Kind of a twist on superheroes. Anyway, one of the characters is a superhero. She's a woman. She's dating this boy who's not a superhero. And in a scenario of a first date, she's pretending to not be able to bowl very well. So she's feeling anxious in this scenario because she knows the stereotype is that, well, the man should be able to do better. So she's feeling anxious, changing her behavior. So an example from fiction. Hopefully I've explained it well enough. It's the first one that came to my mind. Elderly people have a lot of stereotypes about them and will experience a lot of stereotype threat. So low SES peoples, individuals with disabilities, addicts in recovery, any of these groups that have stereotypes around them, they might feel anxious in relevant situations. I saw a video of an actor one time who was going, the scene that they were going to act in was a driving scene. And they knew there was a stereotype around their ethnicity that their ethnicity was a poor driver. And so they felt a lot of anxiety in this scene because they felt like they had to do a really good job driving to kind of cancel out the stereotype that everybody had about their ethnicity. So they felt that stereotype threat, that anxiety, because the stereotype exists. So a whole field of psychology dedicated to studying that. Oh, yep, that's the example I was just talking about. So with these, a lot of these stereotypes are similar to schemas that we have. So, all right, this is also related to attribution theory. So attribution theory is another aspect of social psych. And this is that people are motivated to discover the causes of other people's behavior and make sense of it. So why in the world, for example, today I saw a car accident behind me in a Smith's parking lot, and a person was going back and forth to their car so many times. I was like, why in the world are you going back and forth to your car so many times? And I was trying to make sense of their behavior. I was trying to attribute their behavior to something. And I attributed it in the end, who knows if I was correct or incorrect, that they probably were really anxious because they had just bumped into this person's car. So they weren't thinking very clearly. And so they kept forgetting what they were going back to their car for. Their phone, insurance documents, paper to write on, something like that. So I was trying to attribute something to this person's behavior and make sense of it. So we do this. We use internal and external cues. We try to determine whether a cause is internal versus whether a cause is external. So I kind of attributed their behavior to their internal anxiety was what I did. We try to determine whether it's a stable or unstable characteristic. So in my example, you would call this an unstable characteristic, not because they were anxious, but because they're probably not in their day-to-day life just anxious all the time. That's probably not their general behavior. They were having a state of anxiety after this car accident. And so this was probably not a state that would continue on days after this. And controllable versus uncontrollable causes. So was that person's behavior caused by something they chose to do, something that they could have controlled, or was it something completely uncontrollable? So internal versus external. Internal is traits and abilities. External would be like causes outside of the person. So why did that person do well on the test? Well, maybe the test was easy, as an example of an external cause. Versus internal is a trait or ability. Well, why did that person do well on the test? They were really smart. Stable versus unstable. Stable are those things that are not changing, versus unstable is more quickly changing. So a really good example of this is my children, actually. Sometimes they will just get super, super, super grumpy and really mean. So usually this is not a stable characteristic. This is not their general personality all the time to be really mean and like hit me with a magic wand. Today was the thing. My son was holding a magic wand and was trying to do spells on me because he was mad. And he was mad because he didn't take a nap and he didn't eat all his lunch. So he was hungry and he was tired. So this was an unstable characteristic, something that happens more often than I wish it did, but does change. Give him some food, get him a nap. He's now happier and nicer and not trying to cast spells on me and hit me with his magic wand. Controllable versus uncontrollable. We can control some things about ourselves. We can regulate our emotions to certain extents. Obviously, younger children can't can't regulate as well as older children or adults. I can make dinner for my child so that they are not as grumpy, for example. But there are things that we can't control. What if it's raining outside and we're cold, right? What if we don't have a coat? We can't actually go grab something to make ourselves warm. So maybe we're grumpy because we're cold or something like that. So can we actually control that? So as we, as people, look at the behaviors of others, we try to attribute their behavior to things. And these are the kind of clues that we try to use. But with that, we often make errors of why people do things. So I gave my example earlier that my attribution of this person running back and forth from their car was probably because of their anxiety. So let's see if maybe well, we don't actually know why they were doing that. I didn't actually go and ask them. But that's my attribution. Let's see if I might have perhaps made some of these errors. Usually, we as people attribute behaviors to internal characteristics rather than external characteristics. So I attributed a lot of their behavior to their internal characteristic that I assume that person was anxious. But maybe it was actually environmental. Maybe because of the little car accident, maybe there were things all over the place. And so they kind of did have to run back and forth. So it's possible that the behavior I saw running back and forth was actually environmental and not internal. So I could have made that attribution error, is what that's called, an attribution error. So this is the fundamental attribution error. Lots and lots of times we will look at people's behaviors and we will attribute them to some internal characteristic, something about that person inside. And at the moment, I'm like thinking back, oh no, when have I attributed a behavior possibly incorrectly to an internal characteristic of my child or something like that. And I'm feeling bad about probably making this fundamental attribution error. So self-serving bias is another way that we usually make attributions to. So what might a self-serving way of attributing behaviors be? If you did a certain behavior, well, that's not actually a great question. I'll just put the answer up because I think my question was poor. So generally, we attribute our own mistakes to some outside force, or someone else's fault. So our mistakes are someone else's fault, or we attribute it to some outside force, external cause. We might say, oh, the test was too hard. That's why I did bad on this test. The test was too hard. Professor Riches wants us to fail. That's not true. I hope everybody gets an A on the test. That would be great. So we might, when we make mistakes, attribute things to external causes versus internal causes. So, I mean, it might be the case in any given situation that maybe the test was too hard, right? But our self-serving bias in attributing our own behavior tends to be that we think our mistakes or things that we've done are caused by external things. So we also think things that we did well are down to what's inside of us, our internal personality traits, things like that. So now we'll jump from attribution to attitudes. Attitudes is another aspect of social psychology that's studied a lot. So an attitude is an opinion and belief about people, objects, ideas. So essentially how we feel about things in the world. So you might have an attitude that is around climbing. You might have an attitude towards skateboarding. You might have an attitude towards driving or doing a motorcycle. So the stronger our attitudes on any given topic, the more likely we are to act or behave on that attitude. So if a person is more aware of their own attitudes as well, they'll be more likely to behave on that attitude. So you might have a not very strong attitude towards a certain group of people or a certain kind of activity. So my attitude towards the game of bridge is not very strong at all. One, I don't really know what the game of bridge is about, so I don't really have a strong attitude towards it, positive or negative at all. I don't really know what it is. So I'm not really going to behave in any way, particularly because I don't have a strong attitude towards it. if I thought bridge was like the greatest game in the world or the worst game in the world, that might change my behavior when I find out, let's say, someone I know plays it. Now I should probably go and look up bridge after this class period. Also, if the person has a vested interest, they're more likely to act on it as well. So if I like bridge, if I played bridge, if I was in a club, I'd probably be more likely to act on that. I feel bad using bridge playing as an example when I know essentially nothing about it other than it exists. So I apologize. Probably shouldn't use examples of things I know nothing about in class. This is all related to another big area of social psychology, the theory of planned behavior. So with these things, we've talked about attitudes, we've talked about attributions, we've talked about social perceptions, all these things, as well as these other topics right here. So we've talked about attitudes, subjective norms, and our perceived behavioral control are all kind of key components of if that lead to our intention to behave in certain ways. So let's use voting as an example. There's an election coming up, right? So our attitudes towards voting at all, so just the act of voting, will lead towards, will be one component that's related to our intention to vote. So if your attitude towards voting is really, really strong, so let's say your attitude is really strong, right? You might be more likely to vote. If your attitude towards voting is very, very weak, if you don't have a strong attitude, if you're like, oh, voting, well, whatever, then your intention to vote is going to be low, and you will be less likely to actually do that behavior as well. The subjective norm is generally, what are the norms that you believe about this thing? So you have a strong or a weak attitude towards voting, maybe that it's positive or negative. What is this subjective norm? What do you think? Do you think voting is a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Somewhere in between there, right? Do you think it can be a useful thing? So what is your norm about it? That will then also influence your intention to behave. So, and your perceived behavioral control. I think voting is actually a really good example here, because let's say you don't think that you have the control to go and vote. Let's say you're working, you know you're not going to be able to make it to a poll. You don't have an address, so you're not going to be able to get a mailed ballot to you or something like that. You don't feel that you have control. Your intention to vote is then going to be pretty low. If you feel like you can do that action of voting, then your intention to vote might be higher if these other aspects are leading you to that as well. So this is kind of the social psych ideas of why anybody behaves in any given way. I'm using the behavior of voting, but this is also related to a behavior of asking someone on a date, or learning to drive, or going to the store, a behavior of rescuing someone, or whistleblowing and doing something heroic. So basically any behavior is what the theory of planned behavior is talking about. It's a big social psych theory that looks at why do people do a behavior. And one of the big pieces is that intention and then that behavior. So since then, there's been some updates. So you can see this is the model as of 2019. So these, if you look carefully, the old model was essentially these three blocks and this one and this one. So attitude, norm, perceived behavioral control, attitude, norm, perceived behavioral control. Those are still there, but now we've seen, oh, there are actually other aspects behind that lead to our attitude. So what are our beliefs about the behavior? That leads to our attitude. What are our normative beliefs? And that leads to the actual subjective norm. What are our control beliefs? That leads to our perceived behavioral control. And then we might believe that we can go and vote, right? We might believe that we have the power to get out to the polls or drive our ballot to a drop-in box or something. But what if our car doesn't actually start? What if we actually don't have that behavioral control in that time? Well, even though we have every intention of voting, the actual behavioral control that we have moderates this relationship. So essentially, you're seeing the beginning of the theory of planned behavior here and where it's evolved to over time and been added to have a better understanding of why people behave. And generally, these attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control are all influenced by the people around you. Yeah. With the time we have now, I definitely think we can get through chapter 11, but I also think we should probably take a break right here before jumping further into more aspects of attitudes. So let's pause right now, take a quick break, come back at 8:37. And so use this time to use the restroom, get a tea or something like that, and be back at 8:37. All right, we are back. Hopefully it's sharing properly so you can see my screen here. Let's get back to it. All right, so I've kind of been running through social psych really quickly to make sure that we get all these basic concepts. Questions that anyone has as you're sitting there thinking about things? So we've been talking about attitudes, attribution errors, how we use things like stereotypes and person perceptions. Questions about any of these? Questions about theory of planned behavior at all? So theory of planned behavior is a really useful one to know about when trying to think of any kind of behavior. So rather than using these attribution errors, you can think of, well, what was the person's intention with this behavior? Maybe if you can understand that better by understanding, well, what is their attitude toward whatever behavior they actually did, the subjective norm they have about that behavior, and their perceived behavioral control. Well, maybe the person didn't come to your party because they didn't actually have any behavioral control over the opportunity to come to your party or something like that. So just as an example. So let's talk about cognitive dissonance quickly. So cognitive dissonance is a big area of social psychology. It's essentially a feeling of discomfort, or in other words, dissonance, caused by a person holding two conflicting or inconsistent attitudes at the same time. So if you have two inconsistent attitudes, thoughts, or beliefs at the same time, you might feel dissonance about that. Let's say you have an attitude that, or a thought, or a belief that fruit flavored, like fruity flavored ice creams are really good. But then at the same time, you think, well, I really don't like strawberry flavored ice cream. So these might be in conflict. They're probably not that core to your identity and just general things in life. So it might be a little bit uncomfortable to think, well, I really love fruit flavored ice creams, but I absolutely hate strawberry flavored ice cream. How would you get around those two dissonant ideas? Well, the feelings of that dissonance are anxious feelings. You might want to ignore or avoid those dissonant ideas. So you might just completely ignore or avoid strawberry ice cream because it brings up this feeling of dissonance. You feel like, well, I like fruit flavored ice cream, but I really don't like to see strawberry ice cream because I know I don't like that one. And I know this is a really silly example, but it's just an example of how dissonance could play out. So let's watch a little bit more about dissonance theory. Oh, I see what I did.
Chances are good that you've heard of something called cognitive dissonance. It's a term that's starting to get thrown around a lot these days. But you might not know that it has a really deep root in classic social psychology. In 1957, Leon Festinger wrote a book on the theory of cognitive dissonance and outlined a really detailed understanding of what cognitive dissonance is and how people deal with it. Let's start out by talking about what cognitive dissonance is. How would we define it? At the very basics, cognitive dissonance is about inconsistency. When we hold two thoughts that are inconsistent with one another, basically, that's dissonance. So let's take the example of someone who smokes cigarettes. Here's a person who might have two distinct thoughts, one of which is, I regularly smoke cigarettes. The other of which is the knowledge that smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Here are two thoughts that a person can be having at the same time, acknowledging both of these things as fact, but they would seem inconsistent with one another. If you know that smoking is bad, then logically you probably wouldn't be engaging in that activity yourself. And so this is a case of dissonance because there's inconsistency in your own thoughts. So what do people do when they experience cognitive dissonance? Well, there are a few ways in which Festinger said that you could resolve the inconsistency as a way of resolving the dissonance. First, you can change one of those thoughts. So in the case of the smoker who realizes that smoking is bad and also that he is a regular smoker, he might change one of those beliefs and go, smoking's not that bad. It's actually not unhealthy to smoke. That would be changing one of your cognitions, one of your thoughts, as a way of restoring consistency. Another thing you could do is change your behavior as a way to restore consistency. So in this case, the smoker might say, well, if I acknowledge that smoking is bad, then the way I can be consistent is to stop smoking. So changing one of the behaviors that's related to the inconsistency. Another thing people can do is to add new thoughts into the mix, thoughts that help rationalize the inconsistency. So someone might say, yes, smoking is bad. Yes, I smoke regularly. But also I do a lot of other healthy behaviors. I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and I exercise a lot. So I'm adding new thoughts as a way to reduce the problem of inconsistency. And finally, people can just trivialize the inconsistency completely. They can just say, you know what, sure, smoking's bad and I smoke, but I just don't care. And that's going to be it. That's not really as big of a deal as people say that it is. That would be another way of resolving dissonance.
And that's tobacco.
But why do people feel like they need to resolve anything at all? What's the big deal about dissonance? Well, some people say that dissonance just gets in the way of finding some sense of truth. In general, if we want to understand the world, then we want a clear, consistent picture of it. And anything that makes us feel inconsistency is something that's a problem, and we're motivated to restore consistency again. But most of the research in dissonance has looked at something a little bit different. And that idea is that it's physically uncomfortable to experience cognitive dissonance. There's actually some negative physical tension that you feel anytime you recognize two inconsistent thoughts or realize that you've done something through your behavior that contradicts your true attitudes and beliefs. And so lots of studies have shown that this is the case by hooking up different sensors to people or tricking them into thinking that some pill makes them feel uncomfortable when in fact just their inconsistent thoughts is what's doing it. All of this research you can find more about in my blog post on this topic, but suffice it to say that for the most part, when you feel cognitive dissonance, you're feeling actual physical discomfort. You're feeling inner discomfort as well. And anytime we feel bad, we want to feel better. And to feel better, we just find a way to be consistent again. That's the driving force behind cognitive dissonance. It's worth pointing out that there are a couple times.
So there's more to this video on cognitive dissonance, and there's a lot more to the research on cognitive dissonance in general as well. But I wanted to go back to the couple ways to get rid of this dissonance. So let's say our example of two different thoughts. I hate strawberry ice cream, but I love fruit flavored ice creams. So you can change that thought. Well, maybe change the thought of I hate strawberry ice cream. Maybe change it to, well, it's not my favorite. I like it okay. Or change the thought of, oh, I don't actually like all fruit flavored ice creams. That's not that. Actually, that gets a little into another one. So you can change that thought. You can change your behavior. You can stop getting or going around the ice cream that makes you feel that discomfort. And that's a really key piece here that motivates some of our behavior, is that we might want to change our behavior so we don't have those uncomfortable feelings. Another is adding a thought. So we could say, well, yep, I love fruit flavored ice creams, but I hate strawberry flavored ice cream. But that's okay because strawberry flavored ice cream is not real strawberry, so it's not real fruit. It's really just artificial flavor. It's not real strawberry. So if it was real, I'd probably like it. Something like that. Probably all ice creams. Well, I guess it depends the price point. You can get ice creams with real flavor or not. Or trivialize that inconsistency. Saying, yeah, I like all fruit flavored ice cream, but not strawberry. But that's just one fruit. There's a lot of other fruits, so it's not really that big of a deal that I don't like the strawberry flavor. I can still say to myself that I like all fruit flavored ice creams. So again, kind of a silly example, but this goes back to our discussion on attitudes. And so as a reminder, attitudes are part of our, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted presentation mode as well. So attitudes are part of our theory of planned behavior. So our attitudes towards strawberry ice cream or towards smoking or towards voting, all of these can be influenced by that cognitive dissonance. So if we have these beliefs or ideas or thoughts that are inconsistent with each other, it can change our behavioral intention and then change our behavior. So this kind of gives you just a little window into the broad field of social psychology that we've talked about things like attitudes, we've talked about intentions, behaviors, social groups, and we're looking just not even that deep really into this one aspect of cognitive dissonance and how that influences this specific attitude. So any area of social psych isn't just like built off of this model. That's not what I'm saying. But any area that we're touching on in social psych does go a lot deeper. There's a lot more that you can learn about it. Just like in developmental psych, there's only specific things that we can hit on. But this cognitive dissonance can influence your attitude, which then can influence your intention, which can then influence your behavior. Same thing for perceived behavioral control. Things can influence the beliefs you have about that control. Things can change your subjective norms. So a lot of media or books might be trying to change what you think about any different belief or subjective norm in society. So this is just one specific example of how attitudes can change and how we have that kind of physical pain or anxious feelings, that discomfort that motivates us then to change. So we can have other things that motivate us to change things like subjective norms or understand our behavioral control differently and change our intentions. So each of these aspects of this pretty simple model can be can be looked into in a lot more detail at a lot of different levels. So kind of gives you a taste of what the field of social psychology does. So some practical examples, not such the silly examples of ice cream, but victims of domestic violence often experience cognitive dissonance, especially before leaving. Thoughts about that they should leave, that they're in an unsafe situation, but that maybe they're also holding a thought that things will change or this person isn't actually hurting them, that they're thinking the wrong thing. So these two different thoughts at the same time, they can have not only the pain of that situation, but that cognitive dissonance and the anxiety from having that two different attitudes or beliefs or thoughts. So if you've ever changed a religious belief in your life, you've probably experienced cognitive dissonance in that. Or if you've done a behavior that's against a deeply held religious belief, you've probably felt a cognitive dissonance with that as well. May feel that when figuring out your identity. So we only very briefly talked about identity with Chapter 8 today. But when you're trying to find those consistent aspects of yourself to kind of piece those together and say, hey, this is the person I am, you might feel cognitive dissonance through that process and say, well, in these situations, I'm a really friendly and outgoing person, but in these situations, I'm kind of cynical and introverted. So you might see those different things as you're figuring out your identity and have some cognitive dissonance and say, well, and maybe use one of those 4 strategies to either minimize, change a thought, change your behaviors to be more consistent across situations. So these kind of attitudes have a big impact on how we end up behaving and even things like our identity, how we feel about ourselves. So this information that we're getting to now is actually some of the information that one of the groups is going to create a presentation on. So as a reminder, you should be doing a lot of work for your group presentations outside of class. With this format of being online in class discussions like this, we won't actually have that group obviously present right now. They're not ready. They I told them they have till the end of the semester. Everybody has till the end of the semester. But this is the content that that group will be covering. Again, for any of these topics, you can cover the things that are discussed in the book only. You can go beyond that. You can focus and dive in on one specific aspect a lot. So in my presentation on this topic, I'm going to talk about the Asch conformity experiment, the Zimbardo-Stanford prison study, and Milgram's experiment. So I've got a couple videos linked to those, but I think today I'll probably just describe them. They're really good, these social psych experiments. I think maybe we will watch them. I think we might have time. But this should give you some idea of kind of what I'm expecting. You can, if you're in that group or if you're in any group, read the book in this section, see how I focused on this material and how you might have done it differently. And so do that with your own sections for your group project. Think about, well, these are the parts that are most interesting to our group. We're going to focus on those. We're going to maybe ignore the Stanford prison study or something like that as an example. So there is freedom within that group project to kind of focus on the topics that you're interested in and pull in things that weren't necessarily discussed. I don't think one of the studies I'm going to talk about in a little bit isn't mentioned in your book at all, for example. So Asch conformity experiment, let's talk about that first. Let's watch a little bit of this video to give you a better sense. It's more interesting to watch than just have me tell you.
A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1.
2.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3.
3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. 1. 1. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
So always funny to watch that. No matter how many times, it's just incredible to see how people will conform to the group around them. So with that, this kind of social experiment shows that people will tend to conform to the group that they're in, the attitudes of the group, the subjective norms, the behavioral intentions, all these kinds of things. People will with a high likelihood, tend to conform to the group around them. So conformity does influence or increase group cohesion. So like the video said, we are social creatures. I mean, evolutionarily, like we came together as groups. We would never have got to be humans like we are without coming together as groups, helping each other, building off of each other's skills, building communities, mutual aid, things like that. So we would have never got to this point without that. So conforming in some ways can be really good. For example, this picture of these people, they have created a new social rule. So here, I imagine this is something like a DMV, but rather than just standing in line, they've put their shoes out. So rather than standing and fighting over who's in line or whatnot, they're all sitting, they're relaxed more. It looks like a better place to be for sure. Although right now I always see pictures like this. I'm like, where's everybody's masks? But obviously this was taken before all of this. But so they have a new group, a rule here. They're conforming to this. They're putting their shoes out. And this is an example of one time where that's probably pretty useful. They can relax, they can sit down as they're waiting. So it can be positive. Obviously, though, group cohesion and conforming with groups can have a lot of negative effects. So things like traffic rules and laws, that can be positive as well. That seems like such a silly example now. But it can obviously be really negative. Peer pressure, the group can be wrong. They can be dangerously wrong, right? So conformity can be really negative. So what do we do about it? And why do we do it? So we get information from social influences around us, and we want to have a normative social influence. So the video kind of touched on that. We don't like to rock the boat. That's called a normative social influence. And then informational social influence, we get information from people around us. So let's say you walk outside of a building and everybody is looking up towards the sky. Well, you might want to conform to that group behavior and look up at the sky. Maybe they have information that you don't. Maybe a piano's about to fall and they're all watching it, right? Or a UFO is coming down. I don't know why I went with those pretty out there examples, but maybe they have some information that you don't, and you can get that from your social surroundings, right? And then normative social influence is that we want people to like us. We don't want to seem weird. I think the movie Mean Girls is a really good example of this. We want other people to like us, so we might conform to their behavior. We want to have that same kind of social influence. We might use that same slang, wear similar clothes, adopt the attitudes of the group. Some of those adopting of attitudes we saw in, or if you've seen the movie, some of the attitudes that, I forget the main character's name, the actress's name, Lindsay Lohan, some of the attitudes she adopts over the course of the movie, she has some dissonance towards, right? And it changes the intentions of her behavior and then her actual behaviors. So that's where a lot of the problems and drama in the show come from. So we want, though, as humans, to be part of groups, or we tend to want to be part of groups. So that is one area of social psychology and one experiment that kind of shows that pretty well. Milgram's experiment is another one that shows, well, let's watch the video about it, and then we'll talk about what it actually means.
We all want to believe that what we do, how we behave, is purely a function of our personality, our character, things inside of us, our genetic makeup. But to what extent?
To test his theories, he invented an electronic box that
Contrived, developed, and the powerful impact it had on the people in it.
In 1962, Stanley Milgram shocked the world with his study on obedience. To test his theories, he invented an electronic box that would become a window into human cruelty. In ascending order, a row of buttons marked the amount of voltage one person would inflict upon another. Milgram's original motive for the experiment was to understand the unthinkable, how the German people could permit the extermination of the Jews.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people who are courteous and decent in everyday life can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. All right, now the next thing we'll have to do is set the learner up so that he can get some sort of punishment.
What inspired Milgram, I would say there were a number of factors. One of them is he was very ambitious. He wanted to make a mark in social psychology. And he wanted, as he wrote to one friend, he wanted to come up with the boldest experiment that he could think of.
When you roll up your rights.
We talked about in the chapter on ethics how, well, a little bit, that this was actually kind of a big motivator for a lot of social psychologists. So they set up some of these pretty extravagant social experiments to kind of show that they could, one, that they were capable of deceiving people in such a way that these people would do kind of behaviors that are so far out of the norm. So we kind of see that in what Zimbardo as well does with the Stanford prison study. So there's some of that attitudes and subjective norms around in the field of social psychology that led to some of these studies. But let's watch a person go through an actual session of this experiment.
Leave, please. This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Do you have any questions now before we go into the next room?
About 2 years ago, I was at the Veterans Hospital in West Haven.
Mm-hmm.
And while there, they detected a heart condition. Nothing serious. But as long as I'm having these shocks, how strong are they? How dangerous are they?
Well, no, although they may be painful, they're not dangerous. Anything else?
No, that's all.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated?
So I'm not sure if it was clear enough from the video, but this person here who's getting shocked is an actor. They also did this study where it wasn't an actual person in the other room. The actor essentially went to the other room and like turned on a tape recorder, or they would have the actor actually pretend. But usually the teacher can't actually see the actor or the person that is learning.
Front of the shock generator, please.
So the teacher person, they're the subject of the experiment. They're the one that's getting the experiment is, will this person submit to the authority of the experimenter?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is to teach the learner a simple word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 105 volts.
Hard head. Just how far can you go in this thing?
As far as is necessary.
What do you mean as far as is necessary?
Complete the test.
Milgram was very much aware that obedience is a necessary ingredient for society to function. But
75 volts, Jim. Please continue.
some psychologists were troubled by the ethics of it. Many, if not most subjects, found it a highly stressful, conflicted experience. People are stammering, stuttering, laughing hysterically, inappropriately.
150 volts.
Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Clearly, when we say people went to the top of the chalkboard, it wasn't like they were going blithely, sadistically. People went stop and go, stop and go.
So feel free to watch the entire video to get a little more detail about it. But I think seeing the subject's reactions is one of the most important parts there, that they did feel uncomfortable, that, yeah, they did. What is the percentage? Did I put it in the slides? Most people, about 2/3 of people, go all the way up on the voltage range, all the way up to the extreme intensity shock, to the last knob on the thing, the XXX, and they shock all the way up. They think they're shocking that person. In some of the versions that were done, the person, when they got to like 375, they would just stop responding. The learner would stop responding. And that let the teacher think that, well, did this person just pass out? Like, is this person dead? And even in those situations, about 2/3 of people did shock all the way up to the end. They might have protested a little bit or been uncomfortable, but all that the experimenter would say would be things like, it's not going to leave any permanent damage, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue. They didn't ever, they used those kinds of forms of coercion with their authority, but they didn't sit there and say, hey, I'm going to shock you if you don't shock this person. They didn't do anything like that. So this really showed that people sometimes will follow the demands of an authority, and why that idea of I was just following orders can be so problematic. So the key takeaway for why people acted this way is that in a lot of ways they didn't know how they should or could respond in this kind of situation. And we see that in heroism research a lot too. So there might be people in an organization that know the organization is doing unethical things, but they don't have a route to, say, report that in a proper way, or they don't know how they can or should respond. So a lot of people go along with it, continue doing those unethical behaviors. Very few people will actually step out and blow a whistle, for example. So this is one of the areas where my research in heroism ties into the social psych research. Normative information suggests to participants how they should behave. So they know that they should be able to maybe trust experimenters, that experimenters said that they're not going to actually hurt that person. So all these kinds of normative ideas go into their intentions and then their behavior. So it also gave those participants the opportunity to deny responsibility, to blame the experimenter, say, well, I was just following orders. This is all on you. This is all your responsibility. We saw that from that person who clearly felt uncomfortable when the learner was saying, let me out. He said, and the experimenter, all they said was, please continue. He said, oh, well, this is all on you, or this is your responsibility. So they're denying their own responsibility, even though they're the one pulling that switch. So, and these individuals also had limited time to make their decision and think about their decision in that small area, versus whistleblowers. A lot of what we know is that sometimes the final decision comes like really quick, but this has usually been something that they've been mulling over. That they kind of see the unethical behaviors of an organization, and they're trying to think. A lot of times they try to report it through the proper channels that are kind of set up for that. So they have kind of a more extended time as whistleblowers to think about that decision. Versus in this kind of situation, there's a time crunch. There's an experimenter saying, "Hey, do this, shock that person right now." So, questions about either of these studies? I mean, hopefully I've been clear about what they are and what we've learned from them, and how they're related to like theory of planned behavior, attitudes, things like that. But definitely put up your hand or put any chat comments in the comment box too if there's anything that you're unclear of here. All right, so the Stanford prison study, we'll talk about that. It's more about de-individuation. There's entire movies on the Stanford prison study. Essentially, Dr. Zimbardo took a group of students from Stanford, I believe it was, essentially had them agree to do a study, picked some of them to be guards in this prison, and then essentially got the local police to actually go and arrest these undergrad students to then come and be part of this study. So some participants were guards, some were prisoners, and to watch their behavior over time. So since then, there's been a lot of questions about the methodology, and it definitely doesn't have the strongest control and methods. It was definitely being influenced by the experimenter. But it did show that this de-individualization, having some people be guards versus prisoners and giving these guards power over these prisoners, even though they were all just adolescent or young adult college students, led to a lot of abuses of that power. So this led to ideas that we may act uninhibited when we believe no one can identify us. We might see that kind of behavior also coming through in things like cyberbullying, when it can be anonymous. The Stanford prison study participants, for example, wore large glasses and had other names. They weren't themselves in that kind of situation. We see other examples of this in groups around the world. The Ku Klux Klan, for example, they de-individualize themselves. They all become part of a large group. You can't identify that this is Tom or Jerry from down the street because they're de-individualizing themselves. And that can lead to a lot of this group behavior that's pretty problematic. So another thing is that there is social contagion. So this is one aspect of social psychology that's studied, that we tend to imitate behavior, social fads. Yeah. I want to get to the other study. Do I have pictures? Oh, here we go. So let's get to the Rattlers and Eagles study, and then we'll talk about prejudice and racism and how this study is related to it.
Social psychologist Musafar Sharif and Carolyn Wood Sharif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sharif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sharif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the 2 groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers. and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sheriff believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank in the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Mustafar and Carolyn Sheriff had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
So really relevant experiments that are still really useful to think about now, which is obviously why even now, a couple decades after this was done, we still talk about this in Psych 101 or 1010 or with the general psychology class. So let's talk a little bit about some of these social psych aspects and then talk about that experiment again and kind of contextualize it with this research. So with this, groupthink. Groupthink is an impaired group decision making when a group comes together and is thinking in a really similar way, because even the right decision even might be different than what the group is trying to do, but it can be more important to keep harmony in that group. So the idea is that it's keeping harmony in the group to go along with the group. So that's what groupthink is. So with that, a lot of times this comes from people overestimating the power and morality of their own group. So that in-group, out-group bias. So, oh, we're definitely right, they're definitely wrong. So, and overestimating the power of that group. So, and being closed-minded and unwilling to hear other sides. So if you think about the Rattlers versus the Eagles, they essentially, all these boys were the same, right? They were same social class, same area of the world that they were coming from, same socioeconomic class, same religion as well. So with that, they're all very, very similar. So a lot more similar than just people tend to think that they are, right? With that, they did become closed-minded and unwilling to think of the other group, the Rattlers or the Eagles, as anything different than, say, sissies or cowards, some of those words that they described the other group as. So how do you stop groupthink specifically? Well, there's a couple different ways. One is by not isolating into groups. So rather than having separate camps, having a camp together, allowing all sides of any argument to be presented. With that, including experts in debate, so letting people who are experts in the relevant topic area talk about it, even if it's contrary to the position of your group. Having an impartial leader lead these kinds of discussions, and encouraging disagreement within the group as well can get rid of groupthink. Prejudice is defined as the unjustified negative or positive attitude towards an individual based on their membership in a group. So with that, we usually talk about it as being directed at race or ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, or SES. So prejudice is really common in those areas, but it could be directed at any group, right? So it's an unjustified negative attitude or positive attitude towards an individual because they are a member of that group. So what causes this? We learned from that video, realistic conflict theory says, well, maybe it's from when competition between resources, especially when resources are scarce. That might lead to some prejudice and intergroup relations and groupthink, things like that. A natural in-group bias may be a factor that leads to the development of prejudice. Having parents with prejudice. Obviously, the Rattlers and Eagles, they didn't have parents who were Rattlers and Eagles who then passed down these prejudices. But we can see that in day-to-day life. And stereotypes are essentially cognitive shortcuts that we can use to interact with people in our day-to-day life. Like I said earlier, some of our cognitive shortcuts in relation to person perception can be really useful in just dealing with day-to-day life and getting tasks done, but they can lead to really serious errors, prejudice, so they can also lead to discrimination. So the definition of discrimination is an unjustified negative or harmful action towards a person because they are a member of any of these groups. So groups do give us a sense of identity. They can improve self-esteem when we feel like we're part of a group or a tribe or a community. That can be really positive, and it can be really positive. However, they can also lead to negative views of others, dehumanizing others. That in-group, out-group bias can lead to more groupthink, things like that. So how do we decrease those negative aspects and increase the positive aspects of groups? So that's one thing that social psych for a long time was focused on. Well, what are all the negative things that groups do to individuals, or that individuals do to groups, or that groups do to groups? But more recently, other social psychologists have said, okay, so we know a lot of these negative things, but more recently it said, okay, so what can we do to now decrease those negatives, apply what we know, and increase the positive aspects of what groups can do together and what people can do when they're working together? So the Rattlers versus Eagles is a really good example of that. You've got these essentially all the same kids that then separate at random into two different groups, the Rattlers, then the Eagles. They hang out and they become solid groups. They have their own in-group bias, their own cultures, their own social norms. And then you put them in fights against each other, right? You play baseball and the winner gets the pocket knives. So there's these limited resources of pocket knives, and they start to develop prejudices, and then they start to do discriminatory behavior towards each other, right? So how did they end up getting rid of that? Well, they did a couple things, right? So the simple contact can be helpful, like having the groups be around can be helpful, and more recent research has shown this. The original researchers didn't think just contact with others would be helpful, but more recently we've found that yes, contact with person in that outgroup can be really helpful when that person's considered the same status, or higher status, but generally same status is better. So how much of prejudice is implicit or, oh, I missed the main point. The video talked about the main point is that working together for common goals seems to be the best ways to break down those groups and create groups around something else, right? So working together to pull out the truck or to fix the water tank or to choose a movie. You can think of, well, we have different groups that some are at each other's throats today in our day-to-day life. What's one thing that we can do is working together for a common goal. Simple contact can be helpful, but working together for a common goal can be one of the most helpful things to break down those barriers, to break down things like prejudice, to break down things like discriminatory behavior. So, how much of prejudice is implicit or automatic, and how do we get rid of it? Well, based on what we've said so far and what you've learned, without necessarily like scrolling to the next couple slides, what are some of the ways that we have talked about to get rid of this implicit automatic prejudice that we tend to have? So just in the chat box or raising your hand, what are some ways that now we've learned we can do to get rid of it? Yeah, that's a really good one, Richard. Anyone else have any things that we've learned so far? You definitely hit the most useful ones for sure. Getting groups to work together for a common good or a common goal, expose it or to the other group. Yep, those are some of the biggest ones. Some of the ones that are researched most and have shown to be the most useful. So another thing to do is starting back at that beginning, the beliefs that lead to our attitudes, that lead to our intentions, that lead to our behaviors. We can start way back there even, and recognizing that we have maybe some stereotype thoughts or impressions about any given group. So if we start way back there, we can even work on it ourselves. You can help other people recognize that they might have implicit bias or implicit impressions about people, and train new habits. So if someone wants to get rid of their prejudice or discriminatory attitudes, train new habits. So thinking specifically, so for example, if someone has an idea about any given group, one thing that they can do is stop and think specifically about individuals in that group that don't fit their own personal stereotype. So if they think a certain group is unintelligent or doesn't think or doesn't read well or doesn't pay attention to something, they could think specifically and find examples of a person within that group that doesn't fit their own bias, that doesn't fit their own stereotype. That can be really helpful. Seeking out contact specifically with members of that group. So rather than being put in contact and having some outside force do that, seeking out contact themselves with members of the opposite group can be helpful. This is why one reason I never delete anybody on my social media, because it gives me contact with people from other groups that have different ideas, especially different political ideas than I might have. I still have that little bit of contact, so I can kind of see like a face to these people rather than, and have experiences with them over time rather than having my stereotypes as I might. So social forces can be immensely powerful. So that power to conform, those things that we've evolved essentially to have these person perceptions to give ourselves a cognitive shortcut, can lead to things like stereotypes, right? So that's not great, but all of these things that we do, this conformity, the ways that groups come together, these can be hacked to do good things instead of harm. And so that's what a lot of researchers that are doing applied research try to do, is use what we know and try to flip it on its head, try to hack these same processes whether they're evolutionary processes, biological processes, whatever processes they're coming from, hack them to use these group processes and the way groups just tend to act with each other to lead groups to do good things, instead of shocking participants all the way up to extreme intensity shock. So this goes into prosocial behavior and altruism, which is where a lot of my research comes from, and looking at why people act heroically. So this is another example of an area in the book from pages 413 to 416 on prosocial behavior and altruism. So these ideas of that Zimbardo found with the groups in the Stanford Prison Study and the de-individualization. Well, how can we combat that? Well, we can help people know that they do tend to put people in these boxes, to de-individualize, to dehumanize people. We can work on that by not giving people power like that. Have people on a level playing field so you don't have someone with all this power over when a person goes to sleep at night, that kind of thing. You can have groups work together for common goals. So you might think in the world right now there might be a lot of fighting, but think maybe are there common goals that maybe everybody, well, about everybody wants to work towards? I think just about everybody that I've ever talked to would like people in general to be able to be housed, have food, have care, things like that. Are there ways that we can go about that together, working on those problems? Are there ways to solve problems like climate problems, right? Yeah, so there are definitely things that we can do to hack these behaviors that we tend to do as groups to use them in more positive ways. Going over prosocial behavior and altruism, with the time we have, I think all I'll do right now is just define them. And so prosocial behavior and altruism are, well, altruism is under the umbrella of prosocial behavior. So prosocial behavior is this big umbrella of any kind of social behavior that is pro-society in some way. So holding a door for someone behind you so they can get in before the door closes on them. That's a prosocial behavior. Helping someone across the street is another example of prosocial behavior. Volunteering is an example of prosocial behavior. So there's a lot of different prosocial behaviors. Altruism specifically is, but with that, I'll stay on prosocial behavior for a minute here. Prosocial behaviors can be beneficial to the actor, to the person that's doing the behavior. If a group is helping other people, they might, or a person is helping another
Can everybody hear me and see me again? Okay, great. So I cannot see all the chats. You might have noticed you're now on my phone instead. So we'll finish up with this topic really quickly of pro-social behavior and altruism, and then we'll finish up for the day. And because we have covered the material that will be on exam 2 already. So we'll finish up with this quick discussion of pro-social behavior and altruism. So I'll start at the beginning of that. Essentially, pro-social behavior is this larger umbrella of any kind of behavior that's pro-society in some way. So an example is, my camera is, sorry for flipping it around. Hopefully I'm not now upside down for everybody. The camera was just a little too low of an angle for my liking. Hopefully the recording is still working as well. So pro-social behavior is a larger umbrella of behaviors that are pro-society. So everything from volunteering, helping someone across the street, holding a door open for someone. One of the people I do research with, he really likes it when people hold the elevator for him at his office. So he will keep candy in his pocket. And when someone does that pro-social behavior of holding the elevator for him so he can get to his elevator, he'll give them a piece of candy. So that holding the elevator is an example of a pro-social behavior. Pro-social behaviors themselves can give us a benefit. We can get a piece of candy or we can get recognition. So how many times have you seen a big news story because someone donated money or is helping other people so they can get recognition that might even boost and give them money in some way, right? Give them some kind of an advantage. So pro-social behaviors can benefit the actor that is doing them. Altruism is under that umbrella of pro-social behavior. It is specific kinds of pro-social behavior that are done not with the intention to benefit the actor. They don't benefit the person. So some examples might be donating money anonymously. So there's no way other people are going to know and give you that kind of recognition. So that's an example of altruism. Anything that you're doing without that intention to get any kind of benefit might be able to be considered altruism. So depending on the researcher you're talking to, they might be a little harder or softer with that kind of line. Is that benefit to you like a good feeling? Does that make it not altruism? There is debate on that. And then heroism is another smaller umbrella under that altruism. So it is both for the benefit of others, not getting a benefit to the actor who's heroic, and it's also a risk to that hero. So they're putting themselves at risk to save someone from a burning building. They're putting themselves at risk to whistleblow about a situation at their job. So pro-social behavior, any behavior that is pro-society, helps other people in some way. Altruism, things that are helpful to other people, but not for the intention to benefit the self. And then heroism, both for other people, not for the intention to benefit the self, as well as risky to the actor themselves. So a little quick bit on the definition there. Sorry, the video went down. Hopefully everyone is still hearing me. The exam does open basically early tomorrow morning. So exam 2, we've now covered chapters 4, 8, 11. Remember, you're able to use your notes on the exam, especially today with the weirdness here where the slides cut out and we weren't able to get through all the slides on chapter 8. Definitely review those before taking the exam. Because we did spend a little more time on chapter 8, you could probably safely assume that there's a few more questions on chapter 8 than there are on chapters 4 or 11. So it's not all chapter 8 for the second exam, but there are definitely more on chapter 8 than there are on chapters 4 and 11, about as much as you would expect from the time we've devoted to them. Questions that anybody has, you can definitely chat. It actually, in this context, it might actually be easier to use your speaker and ask a question, because I'm only seeing messages pop up in my notifications and then disappear. You can also feel free to email me any questions that you have. With that, if there's a question that I feel has been asked that everybody needs to know, I'll definitely send an email out to everybody. All right, again, work on that study guide for Unit Exam 2 as well. That'll prepare you for the types of questions specifically, as well as just the format of the exam. Again, it's totally multiple choice. Your second question paper, which is now called the midterm question paper, is due Saturday. So make sure you get that in as well. You can, again, take the exam over Thursday and Friday, even though technically it's fall break. For our class, we're not actually on the campus, but you're not required to do any class activities on those days. But you could if you wanted to, because Canvas is available, the test is open, so you could take it. All right, well, sorry for the weirdness of my computer freezing. I was just telling my wife a little bit earlier, maybe I should get some more RAM for my computer. Trying to decide, get more RAM or just replace the computer. We'll see. Still haven't decided even with this. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed learning about those social experiments. I think they're really interesting, pretty clear examples of the things that we learned from them, and sometimes pretty fun to watch, even though they can be a little disheartening as well. I like to end with that rattlers and eagles experiment, because it shows that, yeah, these social groups, there's a lot of pressure and evolutionary mechanisms that bring us together as groups and allow us to survive, and can lead us to do really not nice things to other groups. But we can also use the same kind of hacks that bring us together to bring us all together in other ways too, which I really like about social psychology, as well as developmental psychology. So hopefully you like those experiments as well, and have a good night. Email me any questions, because I'm not seeing any pop up. So I'm sorry if you do have questions. I haven't seen any notifications. So have a great night, everyone. And hopefully this recording worked, and I will put it up for students who didn't make it today. Have a good night.